Hi there, I'm Dr. Sam Carr. I'm a psychologist, an author, and a researcher in different areas of psychology. But I'm making this series about attachment theory, and it's for anybody who wants a deep dive into what attachment theory is, how it's applied, the ifs, buts, and maybes of attachment theory. A theory that gets thrown around a lot, but is often misinterpreted, and assumptions are made about it that I think get warped and distorted in culture. So I'm making this deep dive for anybody who wants to educate themselves about attachment theory in more depth. And so you have more of an idea of the complexities in the theory. And this is going to be the second video where I actually talk about the theory itself, and it follows on from the video that preceded this, which was where I talked about this very simple question that theoretically we think children ask themselves over the course of their early life with their caregiver. And if you haven't watched the video before this one, I'd suggest watching it because it will help you appreciate what I mean here. But for anybody who doesn't have time to do that, I'll try to get you up to speed here as quickly as possible. What I said in the last video, and what we think is a central assumption in attachment theory, is that children ask themselves a very simple question. They ask it unconsciously. They don't walk around with a clipboard literally sort of ticking this box or not ticking this box. But somewhere over their first few years, maybe even less than that, of life with their caregiver, or more than one caregiver, but with their caregiving environment, children ask the basic question, can I count on my caregiver or caregivers to be available and responsive when needed, when I really need them, and when I'm in distress or afraid or vulnerable? And the three possible answers children can come to in relation to that question are going to be, yes, I can really count on my caregiver to be there. No, I really can't. Or maybe, I'm not sure, they're very unpredictable. And it's the answers to that rudimentary question. And of course, you don't come to that conclusion as a child quickly. It would take time and time again of you experiencing distress, of you feeling vulnerable, you expressing that in whatever way you express it, and your caregiver responding. Eventually, over time, repeatedly, you're going to come to a conclusion that, yeah, this is the deal. This is the deal in this place. This is how it is for me. This is how my caregiving relationship works and what I can expect. And the reason that's so important is, once you've reached that conclusion, once your psyche has sort of made a decision about the kind of environment you're in, what then seems to happen is you adapt to that environment. You take shape according to the environment you find yourself in. Your psyche takes shape. Your internal world begins to take shape. And that's the essence of attachment theory as we know it. What we're kind of saying is your psychological, emotional, behavioral system, you as a human being, take shape around the kind of caregiving environment you find yourself in. And the language that attachment theory uses are terms like, well, what then begins to happen is you develop what we call an internal working model of attachment. And in the attachment literature, that's what we kind of call it. Your internal working model of attachment begins to emerge in response to the environment you find yourself in. And what I'm basically saying, to put it really, really simply, is what therefore happens is the yes children, the no children, and the maybe children develop different ways of organizing themselves and their psyches based purely on the kind of environment they find themselves in. And we call that the internal working model. I think basically that model later becomes what's known as your attachment style. It's the way you operate in attachment relationships or close relationships, because that's what your environments have taught you should do. So what I want to talk about here in this video is, well, what does that internal working model of attachment look like, and how is it different for children who grow up in what we've said is a yes environment? Yes, I can count on my caregiver or caregivers, versus children who say no or maybe I can't count on my caregiver. What kind of things might start to shape differently in those children? Because that's what we're ultimately saying are that's the way in which working models or the inner world of such children begin to diverge and go down kind of different pathways, depending on whether you're a yes, no, or maybe child. And I'll go through this in a very simplistic way. What kind of things take shape differently in the different kinds of children that I've just talked about? Well, I'm going to put a table on the screen in a second that in a very simple way gives you a rundown of the sorts of things that might be different in yes children versus no or maybe children. It's not exhaustive and it's not always exactly like I'm showing you here, but this is just to give you a rudimentary grasp of what I mean. So let's imagine that you think about something like your view of yourself. If you're a child who's grown up in a yes environment, well, yeah, I can count on my caregivers when I feel distressed and express that. My caregiver is there. They respond appropriately and reliably. My view of myself begins to take shape in the sense simply that I feel like I'm lovable and I feel like I'm worthy, because I must be, because every time I'm vulnerable in need, every time I express that, they respond. So there must be something about me that's worth loving, worth responding to. Whereas in a no and a maybe environment, you're less likely to come to that conclusion. And actually, somewhere deep down, maybe you come to the conclusion that, well, maybe I'm not worthy. I'm obviously not worthy enough that they want to respond to me or seem to respond to me when I'm distressed. So maybe there's something about me that I'm not lovable or I'm not worthy. And that fundamental idea of self might begin to emerge differently in yes versus no/maybe children. I'm lumping no and maybe children into the same category for the purpose of simplicity here, but they may actually be a little bit different in the way that things unfold. But for this purpose, I'm going for the distinction between yeses and nos or maybes. So that first thing's really important to think about. Secondly, of course, your view not only of yourself but of others is going to change and be different depending on whether you are a yes or a no or maybe child. So for the yes children, they've had an environment where other people are responsive. Other people seem interested when they are distressed or vulnerable. Other people reliably support them when they feel stressed and vulnerable and provide them with comfort and soothe them. So their idea of others is taking shape around the idea that, yeah, other people are available, they're responsive, they're supportive, they're consistent. Whereas in the opposite model, other people are unavailable, they're rejecting, they're absent, they're inconsistent. So the idea of others takes shape differently. So the fundamental thing, and I think this is so important for relationships, in relation to these yes children versus the no's and maybes, is that their view of self and their view of others can begin to take shape radically differently. And other little things too then begin to take shape. So if you think about the way your attention works in relationships, I'm giving you one example here of another thing that can shape itself differently. In relation to attention, what we can find often is that, particularly maybe in maybe children, and let's take the maybe children as an example here, children who aren't sure if their caregiver is available, they might be, they might not be, but you're never quite sure. That can be quite stressful to think, well, if I really do existentially need them, and things really get difficult for me in some way, shape or form, I can't be sure that they're there. So maybe I'm going to need to be hyper vigilant to them, maybe cling to them like a limpet, or constantly monitor where they are, because then I've got more control over whether they're going to be there and respond to me when I need them. So things like your attentional strategies. So you may spend a lot of your time paying attention to the person you're in a relationship with because you have to, because you feel like when I really need, they're not going to be there if I don't. So you're sort of compensating for what's deficient in your attachment environment as a kid by paying careful attention and being hypervigilant. Whereas you wouldn't need to do that if you're a yes child. You can just think, well, I can be relaxed about that because I trust that my caregiver is there in the wings, or will be if I express that I need them. So you can be not so hypervigilant. And later you can see how those sorts of behaviours can grow into the sort of constantly checking on partners kind of behaviour, constantly wanting to know where partners are, because your attentional system begins to configure itself around that environment. Beyond attention, you've got things like, well, what do I expect in a relationship? Do I expect care when I need it? Or is it not something I should expect in a relationship? When I need, I just won't expect anything from other people. Or what do I expect from a relationship? Do I expect a relationship is a generally safe and secure space to be in? Or are relationships in general something I expect to be risky, or something that will stress me out and make me feel afraid, and so I constantly need to control that? So even the expectation of what a relationship is and what it will bring you can be radically different in yes versus no children. And then things like, well, how do I feel about exploring the world and potentially encountering things that are distressing? How do I feel about that? Well, if you're a yes child, what we might call the secure internal working model, you don't fear distress. It's obviously going to be something challenging to you when you go out into the world and you encounter new things, and sometimes you hurt yourself and sometimes things are distressing, but it's nothing to fear, because on a deep, deep level, you have a trust that you're not alone in it. You're not alone in it because you haven't been in your caregiving environment from the very beginning. Your distress has been regulated and soothed with somebody else. So the whole idea of distress isn't so terrifying. Whereas if you're a no or maybe child, distress is something to be feared, largely because you're on your own in relation to distress. So you're either going to have to step up to the plate and constantly deal with it yourself, or never encounter it and be afraid of it and try and keep away and avoid distress as much as you possibly can, because at least then you won't be on your own in it. So even things like your relationship with distress can be very, very different. And if you take all of this as a whole, what we're essentially seeing is your whole view of relationships, self, others, how I should be in relationships, how I behave in relationships, how I function in relationships, takes shape differently. And that all grows, according to attachment theory, out of that early attachment relationship, that early decision that yes, no, or maybe I can, can't, or I'm not sure whether I can count on my caregiver or not when I need them. So what we're saying is, from that early caregiver relationship, an internal working model of attachment, which I think you could say is synonymous with what we call attachment styles, the first prototype of your attachment style or your internal working model of attachment sort of grows out of that. And obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, that you're not stuck with that forever, because in time, and I will talk about this in the next video, we meet and engage with other relationships beyond our caregivers and our parents or whoever cared for us when we were growing up. And they give us different models of relating. So our model can constantly be updated and sort of rewritten and re-scripted. But the one we start with is our starting point. So it does matter. And in the next video, I'm going to talk a bit more about that sort of pathway through life, where as you meet and relate to new close other people, your internal working model of attachment or your attachment style begins to get resculpted, reshaped, updated. So you're not stuck with what you have in childhood, but at the same time, it is your starting point. And if you start from a long way out at sea, you're obviously going to take a lot longer to get closer to shore than if you start close to the shore, if you see what I mean. So in attachment theory senses, that early working model is kind of important. But in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about internal working models of attachment, adult attachment styles, how they change, how stable they are, what we know about that kind of process, and a bit more about adult attachment styles in general, because by the time you reach adulthood, you've got your own internal working model of attachment that's partly the one you started with in your early caregiving environment, and also partly a function of all of the people that you've gotten close to, loved, been in intimate connection with from childhood onwards. So we'll talk a bit more about that in the next one, but this video has very much been about, well, what is an internal working model of attachment or attachment style, and how does that grow out of your early caregiving environment? They were the key things to take away from this video.